There is a figure who appears at the start of every map. He arrives before knowing, and he returns after it. A medieval German poet placed him on a horse and called him Parsifal. A Russian novelist in 1868 called him Prince Myshkin. A Spanish writer in 1605 called him Don Quixote. The Orthodox Church called him Eurodivi. The Sufis told stories of a man named Nasrudin. In the 12th century, a Zen master painted him as the 10th and final picture of the path to awakening, barefoot, returning to the marketplace with nothing in his hands. And on the very first card of the tarot, the one numbered 0, he stands at the edge of a cliff, looking somewhere only he can see. Different centuries, different traditions, the same figure. The wisest texts ever written agree on something the modern world cannot tolerate. That real wisdom, at the moment it arrives, will not look like wisdom at all. It will look like foolishness. And the people who carry it will, for a time, look like fools. This is the figure we have come to meet tonight. In the early 13th century, the German poet Wolfram von Eschenbach wrote a strange kind of hero. Not a warrior raised in courts, not a prince trained in strategy, not a boy prepared for greatness. In Parzival, written around 1210, the future Grail Knight begins in almost total ignorance. His mother hides him deep in the forest after his father is killed in battle. She does not teach him politics, lineage, theology, or war. She keeps him away from language itself, away from ambition, away from the machinery of civilization. He grows up without knowing what a knight even is. And then one morning, he sees them. A group of armored riders moving through the trees, sunlight striking metal, voices echoing through the forest. Parsifal stares at them as though he has seen angels descend into the world. In some versions of the legend, he even mistakes them for gods at first. The scene matters because Wolfram could have introduced his hero any other way. He could have shown intelligence, nobility, potential, signs of destiny. Instead, he begins with bewilderment, a sacred confusion, because the tradition already understood something modern people no longer remember. The beginning of transformation does not happen when someone knows enough. It happens when they finally encounter something larger than the structure of the life they have inherited. And the first response to that encounter is almost always foolishness. Parsifal immediately decides he wants to become one of the riders, not because he understands chivalry, not because he has studied virtue. He is moved by recognition before comprehension. Something in him moves toward the image before the mind can explain why. Joseph Campbell, in The Hero with 1,000 Faces in 1949, noticed that myths repeatedly begin this way. The hero does not begin wise. The hero begins called. And the call usually makes the person look irrational to everyone around them. A career abandoned too suddenly. A marriage left behind. An obsession no one else understands. A direction that cannot yet be defended in language. From the outside, it resembles stupidity. But the old stories insist on a difficult possibility. Sometimes the part of you that recognizes truth arrives before the part that can explain it. This is why Parsifal becomes almost embarrassing in the early parts of the Grail story. He asks the wrong questions. Sometimes he fails to ask the right ones. He misreads situations. He copies gestures without understanding their meaning. Wolfram presents him not as enlightened, but as painfully incomplete. Robert A. Johnson, in He, Understanding Masculine Psychology, argued that Parsifal represents the stage of the psyche that must leave inherited identity behind before real consciousness can emerge. The fool is not wise because he lacks ignorance. He is wise because he has not yet become fully trapped inside second-hand certainty. Children possess this quality briefly. So do seekers at the very beginning, before sophistication hardens into performance, before identity becomes a prison defended by intelligence. The modern world rewards the opposite condition. It rewards immediate fluency, immediate opinions, immediate self-definition. To not know is treated almost like moral failure. Silence becomes weakness. Hesitation becomes incompetence. The person who says, "I do not understand this yet," loses status instantly. But nearly every contemplative tradition begins there on purpose. The forest, the confusion, the encounter, the movement towards something not yet understood, because the fool appears wherever life begins to exceed the boundaries of the known self. And this is why the Grail cannot be found by the already certain mind. Parsifal fails repeatedly before he becomes capable of seeing what the Grail actually is. The old stories insist that innocence alone is not enough. But they insist on something equally important. Without that original innocence, the journey never begins at all. The fool is not the final stage of wisdom. He is the door. 6 centuries after Wolfram wrote Parsifal, another figure appeared carrying the same wound, this time not in a forest, but in a train. In 1868, Fyodor Dostoevsky published The Idiot, introducing one of the strangest protagonists in modern literature, Prince Lev Nikolaevich Myshkin. He arrives in St. Petersburg after years in a Swiss sanatorium for epilepsy. He owns almost nothing. He has no social power, no strategic instinct, no talent for manipulation. He speaks too honestly. He listens too openly. He trusts people he should not trust. And within pages, nearly everyone around him begins treating him with the same word: idiot. But Dostoevsky was doing something deliberate. In letters written while composing the novel, he described his impossible goal: to portray what he called a positively beautiful human being. Not a genius, not a conqueror, a beautiful soul placed inside a corrupt society. And the terrifying thing is that society immediately experiences such a person as weakness. Myshkin enters rooms where everyone is performing intelligence, performing sophistication, performing status. Every conversation contains hidden negotiations for power. People speak indirectly, strategically, defensively. Nobody says exactly what they mean because everyone is protecting an image. And then Myshkin arrives incapable of playing the game, not unwilling, incapable. He tells the truth at the wrong time. He answers sincerity with sincerity. He responds to humiliation with compassion instead of retaliation. Again and again, people mistake his openness for stupidity because they cannot imagine someone moving through the world without calculation. This is the deeper layer of the fool archetype. Not ignorance, transparency. The fool frightens society because he exposes how much of ordinary social life depends on performance. Dostoevsky understood this perfectly. The people around Myshkin constantly oscillate between 2 reactions. First, they dismiss him. Then, slowly, they become disturbed by him. Because his presence begins revealing something unbearable inside themselves: artificiality. A room full of masks becomes unstable when one person stops wearing one, and this is why truly sincere people often produce discomfort long before admiration. The modern world claims to value authenticity endlessly. But genuine transparency remains dangerous to social systems built on role-playing. Someone who speaks too directly destabilizes hierarchy itself. Everyone else suddenly becomes aware of the invisible performance they are participating in. This is why Myshkin feels almost supernatural to the other characters. Not because he possesses power, because he lacks defenses. There is a scene early in the novel where he speaks openly about death, suffering, and compassion with such naked honesty that the entire conversation around him begins changing shape. People who intended to mock him start revealing themselves instead. The emotional gravity of sincerity reorganizes the room. Carl Jung would later write, in Psychological Types in 1921, that modern consciousness becomes trapped through over-identification with socially rewarded functions. The fool appears wherever the vulnerable and rejected dimensions of the psyche begin returning to awareness, not as regression, as correction. Myshkin carries this quality almost unbearably. He moves through a society built on ambition while remaining psychologically undefended. And because he does not armor himself correctly, everyone around him first interprets him through the only category modern societies understand for undefended people: fool. But Dostoevsky keeps asking the same impossible question beneath the novel. What if the sickness belongs to the society, not the innocent man moving through it? And this is where the fool becomes dangerous. Because once that question appears, intelligence itself starts looking different. The people surrounding Myshkin are brilliant at strategy, manipulation, seduction, reputation, self-preservation. But almost all of them are internally fragmented, terrified, divided against themselves. Myshkin alone remains whole, not successful, not protected, whole. And the old traditions repeatedly insist that wholeness and social intelligence are not always the same thing. Sometimes they become opposites for a while. This is why wisdom so often looks foolish at the exact moment it first appears. Because the world recognizes calculation much faster than innocence. In 1605, Miguel de Cervantes published what many consider the first modern novel. And at its center stood an old man who had read too many stories. Alonso Quijano spends so much time consuming tales of chivalry that eventually the boundary between imagination and reality begins dissolving. He renames himself Don Quixote. He puts on broken armor, climbs onto a dying horse, and rides into the world believing he is a knight living centuries too late. Everyone around him sees the same thing immediately: madness. Children laugh at him, innkeepers mock him, aristocrats manipulate him for entertainment. Again and again, Cervantes places Quixote inside situations where reality humiliates him publicly. The famous windmills are only the beginning. Everywhere he goes, the world refuses to cooperate with the vision he carries inside himself. And yet, the novel survives because something inside the reader slowly becomes unsettled. Because beneath the absurdity, Don Quixote possesses something the sane characters around him have already lost: meaning. The people mocking him are often cynical, exhausted, spiritually asleep. They understand how the world works, but they no longer believe anything transcendent can move through it. Quixote, by contrast, continues perceiving the world symbolically, dangerously symbolically. An inn becomes a castle. A peasant woman becomes a lady. Ordinary suffering becomes part of a sacred adventure. Cervantes creates a man who appears ridiculous precisely because he refuses to reduce reality to its lowest explanation. And this is why the fool archetype often appears near the death of a civilization. When cultures become overly sophisticated, overly ironic, overly intelligent, they begin losing contact with symbolic perception itself. Everything becomes strategy, utility, productivity, skepticism. The modern mind becomes very good at analysis and very poor at reverence. Quixote walks directly against that movement, not intelligently, faithfully. This is what makes him painful to watch. Part of the reader knows he is deluded, but another part recognizes something almost unbearable beneath the delusion: the human need for enchantment. Not escapism, enchantment. There is a difference. Escapism flees reality. Enchantment perceives depth inside reality. And Don Quixote exists precisely at the unstable border between the two. This is why the novel still feels psychologically alive 4 centuries later. Cervantes accidentally created one of the great symbolic portraits of the divided modern soul. One part trapped inside rationality, another starving for myth. Carl Jung later argued in The Symbolic Life that modern people do not suffer because they have too many myths, but because they no longer live inside one consciously. The symbolic function collapses and life becomes spiritually flat. Quixote refuses flatness, even when reality punishes him for it. And this is where the fool becomes more complicated. Because not every fool is wise. Some forms of foolishness are genuine fragmentation. Fantasy detached from reality. Inflation, delusion. The old traditions understood this too. The fool walks dangerously close to chaos because he abandons socially agreed certainty before he has found deeper ground beneath it. That is why Don Quixote matters here. He stands at the threshold where vision and madness nearly touch. And every real transformation passes near that border for a while. A person leaves an old identity before the new one has stabilized. Old ambitions stop making sense. The life everyone else still calls successful begins feeling dead. Something invisible starts reorganizing perception itself, and from the outside, this process often looks irrational. The person changes direction too suddenly, speaks differently, withdraws from games they once cared about, becomes difficult to categorize. The old world begins calling them foolish long before it understands what is happening. This is one of the oldest patterns in human history. The fool appears whenever a human being stops worshipping consensus, reality completely. And that is why societies laugh at him first. Laughter is often the nervous system's response to destabilization. Don Quixote rides through Spain carrying a truth too large for the modern mind to hold comfortably. Human beings cannot survive on realism alone. Something inside us requires myth, symbolic depth, sacred orientation. Without it, intelligence becomes sterile, and the world slowly loses its soul. In the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 1, verse 27, Paul writes something so psychologically dangerous that most modern people no longer hear it clearly. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. Not the intelligent things, not the powerful things, the foolish things. And centuries later, in the Orthodox Christian world, an entire spiritual tradition emerged around that sentence. They were called the Eurodivi, the Holy Fools. From roughly the 11th century onward, figures began appearing across Russia and Eastern Christianity who behaved in ways almost impossible for ordinary society to understand. Some walked barefoot through snow. Some dressed like beggars despite being deeply revered. Some spoke in riddles. Some insulted kings publicly. Others pretended madness deliberately in order to escape praise, status, and spiritual pride. To the outside world, they looked broken. But the tradition saw something else: freedom. One of the most famous was Saint Basil the Blessed, born around 1469, the same figure whose name would later become attached to St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. Stories describe him confronting Ivan the Terrible directly, speaking to power without fear because he no longer depended on the social world for identity. This is what made the Holy Fool terrifying. He could not be controlled through status. The Eurodivi represented a form of spiritual nakedness. A person who had stepped so far outside ordinary ambition that society no longer knew how to negotiate with them. They embarrassed the powerful simply by existing. Their lives became living criticism of vanity, greed, performance, and pride. And this is where the fool archetype reaches one of its deepest layers. The fool is dangerous because he exposes invisible agreements. Everyone silently agrees to pretend certain things matter absolutely: prestige, hierarchy, wealth, image, sophistication. Social life depends on those agreements remaining stable. Then someone appears who genuinely does not serve them anymore, and suddenly the entire structure starts looking theatrical. This is why holy fools appear in periods of spiritual exhaustion. They arrive when religion itself becomes too polished, too institutional, too politically entangled. The fool enters almost like divine sabotage, not through power, through absurdity. Paul pushes this paradox even further in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 3, verses 18 and 19. If any man among you seemeth to be wise in this world, let him become a fool, that he may be wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. Become a fool. Not accidentally, deliberately. This is one of the most radical reversals in religious literature because it attacks the deepest addiction of the ego, the need to appear correct. The fool archetype begins wherever that addiction starts collapsing. Not stupidity. Humility before reality. The Eurodivi dramatized this collapse externally. They shattered social expectations so violently that people were forced to confront their own dependence on appearances. Some citizens mocked them, others feared them. But many sensed something strangely pure moving beneath the madness. A consciousness no longer organized around self-protection. And this is why the fool appears so often beside the sacred. Because contact with the sacred destabilizes ordinary identity first. Before illumination comes disorientation. Before wisdom comes humiliation. Before transformation comes the unbearable realization that the self we carefully constructed may not be ultimate after all. Modern culture has almost no language for this stage anymore. It immediately pathologizes, diagnoses, categorizes, and sometimes that is necessary. Genuine psychological collapse exists. The traditions knew that too, but they also understood another possibility. That occasionally, what looks like madness from inside one system is actually freedom from that system. The holy fool stands exactly on that terrifying border, and every society struggles to recognize him while he is alive. Because he carries a truth the collective ego cannot comfortably tolerate. A human being who no longer worships status becomes almost impossible to enslave. Somewhere in the Sufi world, a man loses his key inside his house, but instead of searching indoors, he goes outside and begins looking under a street lamp. A neighbor eventually asks why. Nasrudin answers, Because the light is better here. For centuries, the Islamic world preserved stories like this around a strange figure known as Mullah Nasrudin, a wandering fool, half teacher, half clown, sometimes wise, sometimes absurd. Nobody knows exactly when he lived historically. The stories moved across Persia, Turkey, Central Asia, and the wider Sufi tradition until the man himself became almost archetypal. And that ambiguity matters, because Nasrudin's foolishness is never merely stupidity. It is revelation disguised as stupidity. The joke lands because everyone immediately recognizes themselves inside it. Human beings constantly search for meaning where it is comfortable to search, not where truth actually disappeared. We look where the light is socially acceptable, where language already exists, where certainty feels safe. Meanwhile, the real key remains somewhere darker, inside the house. The fool archetype appears again, here in a completely different costume. Not knight, not saint, not prince. Comic disruption. The Sufis understood that certain truths cannot be transmitted directly because the defended mind immediately resists them. Humor slips past the defenses. Laughter briefly interrupts identity. For 1 second, the ego loosens its grip, and insight enters through the opening. This is why Nasrudin's stories often feel strangely disorienting after the laughter fades. The conscious mind expects a clean morale. Instead, it receives paradox. A man rides backward on a donkey. A fool searches for a key where it cannot possibly be. A drunk speaks more truth than the sober scholars around him, and beneath the absurdity, the same pattern keeps appearing. Wisdom arrives wearing the mask of foolishness because the ego lowers its guard around fools. Jalal ad-Din Rumi, writing in the 13th century, pushed this paradox even further. In the Mathnawi, he writes, "Sell your cleverness and buy bewilderment, not knowledge. Bewilderment. Because bewilderment is what happens when the structure of ordinary understanding begins breaking open. The modern world treats confusion as failure, but the contemplative traditions often treated it as threshold experience, a sign that the mind had reached the edge of its own map. And this is why the fool appears so frequently beside intoxication imagery in mystical literature. Not ordinary drunkenness, spiritual intoxication. In Persian Sufi poetry, the lover of God is often called Majnun, literally mad, possessed, driven beyond social reason by contact with something overwhelming. The person appears irrational because ordinary motivations no longer organize their life correctly. Rumi understood that from the outside, genuine spiritual transformation can resemble destabilization. The person stops optimizing themselves socially, stops calculating every interaction, stops worshipping image management. Something larger begins moving through them, and the old personality struggles to maintain control. Again, the world calls this foolishness first, because the collective mind trusts controlled people more than transformed people. Controlled people are predictable. The fool is not predictable anymore. This is why Nasrudin matters beside Parsifal, Myshkin, and the holy fools of Christianity. Different religion, different century, different language, same archetype. The wise man who cannot fully belong to the ordinary social game anymore. And this is also why the fool often carries humor, because humor reveals flexibility of consciousness. Rigid minds cannot laugh at themselves. They protect identity too aggressively. But the fool moves differently. He survives humiliation, contradiction, embarrassment. He bends without shattering because he is no longer defending a fixed image constantly. This is one of the hidden reasons Fools survive spiritual transformation more easily than intellectuals. Intellectual identity becomes brittle. The fool remains fluid. And eventually, beneath all the stories, a deeper pattern starts becoming visible. The fool is not merely someone who knows less. He is someone becoming free from the compulsive need to appear knowing at all. In the 12th century, within the Rinzai Zen tradition, the master Kakuan Shien created a sequence of images known as the 10 Ox-Herding Pictures. They describe the stages of awakening. At first, the seeker searches desperately for the ox, which represents the true nature of mind. Then come glimpses, struggle, discipline, capture, mastery, emptiness, illumination. And modern people usually imagine the story should end there, with transcendence, with perfection, with someone floating permanently above ordinary life. But the final image does something stranger. After enlightenment, the figure returns to the marketplace, barefoot, laughing, carrying nothing. In some paintings, his clothes are wrinkled. His belly hangs outward. He resembles an ordinary wanderer more than a perfected sage. The awakened man does not remain on the mountain, radiating spiritual superiority. He walks back into ordinary life, almost looking foolish again. This is the sixth face of the fool, the return, because every genuine awakening eventually destroys the performance of being awakened. The ego can survive almost anything except real transformation. It can even survive spirituality by turning enlightenment into identity, a role, a costume, a subtle form of superiority. The Zen traditions understood this danger deeply. That is why the final image matters more than the earlier ones. The awakened figure comes back simple, human again. The fool returns at the end of the journey because wisdom has burned away the need to appear wise. And this is where the archetype completes its circle. Parsifal began innocent because he knew nothing. The enlightened fool returns innocent because he no longer needs to protect knowing. Outwardly, the two can look strangely similar. This is why many contemplative traditions describe masters in almost contradictory ways. Deeply wise, yet childlike. Clear, yet ordinary. Serious, yet playful. Present without self-importance. Something rigid has disappeared from them, and modern culture often misreads this completely. It assumes wisdom should look impressive, dominant, certain, untouchable. But the oldest traditions repeatedly suggest the opposite. The deeper a person moves into reality, the less theatrical they become. Performance collapses. Complexity softens. The personality stops straining to maintain significance constantly. And from the outside, this can appear anticlimactic, almost disappointing. The modern mind expects awakening to produce a larger identity. The traditions often describe it producing a lighter one. This is why so many awakened figures throughout history were misunderstood while alive. They no longer behaved according to the social logic people expected from important individuals. Some laughed too easily, some dressed simply, some spoke in stories instead of systems, some disappeared into ordinary work entirely. The ego keeps waiting for transcendence to look extraordinary. The fool keeps returning ordinary. And if you have stayed with this reflection until now, stay with us a little longer. This channel is building a library for people trying to recover a more ancient relationship with mind, symbol, and reality itself. Subscribe if you want to continue walking through these older maps with us. And, perhaps more importantly, leave a comment below naming the face of the fool you recognized most tonight. Parsifal, Myshkin, Quixote, Nasrudin, the Holy Fool. Or perhaps the one still forming silently somewhere inside your own life. Because the truth is that most people encounter the fool archetype long before they understand what is happening to them. A career collapses. An identity stops fitting. Old ambitions suddenly feel hollow. The personality enters a period of confusion, simplification, disorientation. And the world immediately interprets this as failure. But the contemplative traditions kept insisting on another possibility, that sometimes the soul must become socially unintelligible for a while before it can become inwardly whole. And this is why the final Zen image matters so much. The awakened man returns carrying empty hands, not because he found nothing, because what he found could no longer be possessed. On the very first card of the tarot, the figure stands at the edge of a cliff, a small bag over his shoulder, a white rose in one hand, a dog at his feet, and above the image, a number unlike all the others. 0. Not 1. 0. In the symbolic tarot tradition that emerged from the Italian tarocchi cards of the 15th century and was later developed through 18th and 19th century esoteric interpretation, the fool occupies a strange position. He stands before every path and after every path simultaneously. Arcanum 0, the unformed beginning, the completed return. This is why the fool has survived for centuries while so many other symbols disappeared. Because the image describes something fundamental about human consciousness itself. Every real transformation begins with disorientation. The old self cannot accompany you completely into the new life. Something has to loosen first. Certainties destabilize, identity fragments. The map stops functioning before the new map appears, and during that interval, the person almost always looks foolish to the surrounding world. Carl Jung repeatedly encountered this pattern across myth, alchemy, religion, dreams, and psychotherapy. In The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, published in 1959, he argued that archetypal figures emerge independently across civilizations because they belong not to culture alone, but to the deeper structure of the psyche itself. And this is what becomes impossible to ignore now. A medieval Grail knight, a Russian idiot, a delusional Spanish wanderer, Orthodox holy fools, Sufi tricksters, Zen beggars returning from enlightenment, different languages, different centuries, different religions, the same figure. Again and again, humanity arrives at the same terrifying insight. Wisdom begins where the performance of certainty starts collapsing. This is why the fool archetype produces such discomfort in modern life. Because modern identity is built almost entirely around appearing coherent. People construct themselves through opinions, expertise, branding, political positioning, social performance, strategic self-presentation. The personality becomes a carefully maintained structure of recognizability. The fool threatens all of it. He walks into the world carrying uncertainty openly, not as weakness, as openness to transformation. And this is also why genuine awakenings often feel humiliating at first. The person realizes how much of their life was organized around fear. Fear of looking naive, fear of appearing unintelligent, fear of social diminishment, fear of not knowing. The ego would often rather remain miserable than become uncertain publicly. But the fool crosses that threshold anyway. That is why he stands at the cliff's edge. The image is not about recklessness. It is about surrender to a larger movement of life before the conscious mind can fully control it. And perhaps this is why the fool appears so persistently in moments of civilizational exhaustion. When cultures become over-intellectualized, over-performed, spiritually fragmented, the archetype returns to remind human beings of something older than sophistication. That transformation is not manufactured. It is undergone. And the first stage rarely looks impressive. It looks awkward, incomplete, socially unintelligible, like someone becoming impossible to categorize correctly. This is why the Fool is both the beginning and the end. At the beginning, innocence exists because nothing is known yet. At the end, innocence returns because nothing needs to be defended anymore. The circle closes. And perhaps that is the hidden reason wise people so often look foolish for a time. Not because wisdom lacks intelligence, but because reality is larger than the identities intelligence builds to protect itself from mystery. If tonight's reflection stayed with you, share it with someone else quietly searching for language large enough to describe what they have been experiencing. And if there is another symbol, tradition, or archetype you would like this channel to explore next, leave it below. Until then, remember this. Every map of awakening begins with someone willing to stand at the edge of the known world looking, at least briefly, like a fool.